Kia ora koutou, everyone. My name is Ladi Kuda. I'm a consulting engineer with E2 Environmental, a firm here in town. And I focus mostly on topics related to flood hazard and river morphology issues around the country. And so tonight's talk is quite close to my heart. Aside from working at the E2, I'm also the committee member and the treasurer for the Aotearoa Rivers Group, who, together with, I'm sure a few of you here are members of the Canterbury Stormwater Group, and there we go. There we go. You can't hear us? Can't hear me? Can you hear me now? Is that better? Okay, there we go. So the Aotearoa Rivers Group, together with Canterbury Stormwater Group and the UC Connect, have organized this night for you all tonight. Now, a few housekeeping things to take care of just before we start. Mobile phones, just follow my lead and flick that switch over on your phone. And the nearest toilets, of course, are just out the door here around the corner. In the case of an emergency, a fire or an emergency, you will convene when you're coming in, just at the paved area by the geography building. And in case of an earthquake, we'll drop, cover, and hold until the shaking stops, and then we'll exit and convene at the same location. So that's the ideal, but if things go haywire, then just take care of each other. And I have two little fellas, and I was notified this morning when I woke up that today is International Talk Like a Pirate Day. So if we can keep those R's to a minimum, then I'm sure Catherine would appreciate that. So welcome to tonight's edition of the UC Connect lecture. And these lectures are free, of course, but it is asked that you register online, so that we have few seats still available tonight, but they can get packed, and so it's just asked that you register for those. And there is on the webpage there's a mailing list that you can get on to be notified of future lectures as well. So on to what we're here to talk about tonight. Now, the current government has announced a proposal to make more of our rivers quote unquote swimmable by 2040. This has attracted significant controversy, which reflects the sense of urgency that many of us feel about the perilous state of many of our waterways. Tonight, Dr. Catherine Knight, who is the author of the book New Zealand Rivers, An Environmental History, will provide important context to this debate by exploring some of our complex and often conflicted history with rivers since humans first settled here in Aotearoa, New Zealand. I'm not sure who first coined the phrase, we can't know where we're going until we know where we've been. There's another version of it, those who are unaware of the past are destined to repeat it. But Catherine will echo that argument with her belief that knowing our history is an important foundation to forging a better future, both in terms of our environment and our socioeconomic well-being. Catherine has chosen to carry out a very important and noble role in our country, and that is one of an environmental historian. New Zealand Rivers, An Environmental History, which is available at the front. It was longlisted for the Ockham New Zealand Book Award 2017 and was selected as one of the listener's best books for 2016. And I understand it's recently been shortlisted for what's the one that was shortlisted for? The New Zealand Heritage Nonfiction Book Awards, which are coming up in October. Is that correct?
Something like that.
I think so, yeah. Okay. Her previous book, Ravaged Beauty, An Environmental History of the Manawatu, won the J.M. Scherer Major Award for Excellence in Regional and Local History, and the Palmerston North Heritage Trust Inaugural Award for the best work of history related to the Manawatu. Another book that has recently been published, that's titled New Zealand Between the Wars, features a chapter on the era of modernizing rivers, which Catherine has penned. She's a policy and communications consultant and lives with her family in a small farmlet in the Manawatu, where they're restoring the Tokura forest. And I used to live on the eastern side of the Ruahinis, and I know there's still quite a few of those, well, not enough of them, those ancient podocarps left up there. So anybody that is doing work to restore those and to steward them should be commended. She is a policy and communications consultant and lives with her family on a small farm. So that's so. As I said, please keep the pirate R's to a minimum. And with that, please help me welcome Dr. Catherine Knight.
I've got a lapel mic. Is it coming through? Is it? Oh, good. I didn't do anything. I just clipped it on. So hopefully it doesn't fall off. That would be a bad start. And thank you for reminding us, Laddie, that it is Talk Like a Pirate Day or week? Day, okay.
I think it's actually yesterday.
Yeah, I think it was, because it was on the panel, yeah. Where you get all your useful information, RNZ the panel. So thank you very much, Laddie, for that introduction, and thank you to the University of Canterbury, the IPENS Rivers Group, and Canterbury Regional Stormwater Group for the invitation to speak today. It's a great privilege, and I'm really impressed by this wonderful theatre and very big screens. I can safely say these are the biggest screens I've talked in front of, so that alone I'm impressed. So I would like to start by acknowledging that without the connection, the really strong connection between this book and this place, quite apart from having done my master's, I am actually, as Laddie mentioned, I live in the Manawatu now, and that was where I was born and grew up, but I did my master's and my PhD here at this very university, and it was this university that made me in a kind of convoluted fashion. It brought me to this wonderful world of environmental history, so I would like to acknowledge that. But I would also like to start by acknowledging that without the excellent publishing house based on this very campus, I wouldn't be here tonight talking to you about rivers. And Catherine Montgomery, who's seated down the front here, I rang her up, and she's the publisher at Canterbury University Press. And one day, unsolicited, I rang her up and talked to her gave her my pitch on the rivers, environmental history of rivers, which I'd been writing. And she saw merit in that pitch and about a book of the history of rivers, and was brave enough, there's a pun coming, a very bad one, brave enough to take a punt on it. Something that I am eternally grateful for. And I would also, I'm sorry, I will get into the talk sooner or later, but I would also like to acknowledge the very generous funding grant without which the book would not have been possible. There was a couple of grants, but one was from a foundation, a trust called the Phillip Family Foundation, and Peter Sherwin, who presides over that, is actually in the audience today, and I'm very, very grateful, because as publishers will tell you too, publishing in New Zealand is hard enough, non-fiction is even harder, and without that sort of support it's very, very difficult to get these stories out, so I'm extremely grateful. Okay, so going back to, I think, possibly why Catherine was willing to take a punt on this book by a largely unknown writer, I suspect was because rivers and freshwater more generally is an issue that really resonates in Canterbury. I don't need to tell you that. And having lived in Christchurch for 7 years of my life beside the Heathcote River back in the noughties, I was keen to tell the story of Christchurch and Canterbury in relation to its waterways, a story I'm really ashamed to say that I was completely oblivious to when I lived here. It was only after I left and undertook this research that it started to all be revealed to me. And since the earthquakes, the special relationship between people and waterways in Canterbury, and particularly Christchurch, I believe has only deepened, initially in a way that was not entirely pleasing to its residents. I obviously need to add, many of you will be familiar with the black maps of 1850, which landscape architect Di Lucas overlaid with the post-quake aerial photograph, revealing that as a consequence of the quake, Christchurch was effectively being haunted by its environmental past. The myriad streams that had once formed a complex network throughout a vast coastal wetland but had been buried by the city's early engineers and developers had, in the earthquake, reasserted themselves with tragic results. The reassertion of rivers and waterways into the lives of the city's people, at first through an extremely traumatic and tragic event, is something that I believe should now be embraced. And from what I understand, this is happening thanks to the efforts of far-sighted people in the community, the professional sectors, and I hope the government too. So let's get into our metaphorical punts and go for a paddle up the history of our rivers, both national and local. I thought I might start by relating to you how I came to write a book about rivers. My first book, called Ravaged Beauty, was an environmental history of the Manawatu, my birthplace. It was very much an endeavour of the heart, rather than driven by any pressing market demand. As one prominent publisher said, the Manawatu, not the most enigmatic place, is it? Fortunately, plenty of people have read the book and enjoyed it, and would probably beg to differ, having learned, as I did, about the fascinating environmental history of this region. For my second book, I wanted the topic not only to be rewarding for me as a writer and a researcher, I also wanted to meet a need, preferably on a national scale. So I sought the advice of our leading environmental historian, Professor Tom Brooking, at Otago University. He immediately suggested rivers, and he recommended bookending the book with two significant events, one at either end, as is customary for university-trained historians. But not being university-trained, at least not in history, I quietly chose to ignore that custom, and instead, unable to help myself, began with geological time and ended with events today. When it comes to the history of rivers, rather like the tributaries that feed them, there are countless story paths I could follow, all of them, in my view, fascinating in their own right. But this evening, I would like to focus on the period between the dawning of the scenery preservation era in the first decades of the 20th century and the wild and scenic rivers era of the 1980s, and the lessons that part of history offers us today. I would also like to take the liberty of taking you on a few diversions off the main stem to explore some of Canterbury's interesting river stories. In the early 20th century, there was growing disquiet about the loss of so much of New Zealand's natural heritage to progress. And out of the ashes, not only metaphorically speaking, the scenery preservation movement emerged. This led to the Scenery Preservation Act of 1903 and state acquisition of reserves throughout New Zealand. Christchurch's Harry L. was one such scenery preservation advocate, and it was through his efforts that parts of the Port Hills were conserved in their natural state for all to enjoy. He was also instrumental in setting up the scenery preservation in getting the Scenery Preservation Act passed. But as the name of the Act suggests, This movement was not driven by ecological understandings of the environment, but rather a very Victorian sense of scenery. Thus, the emphasis was on landscapes that were aesthetically appealing, and lowlands and lakes were deemed picturesque, while swamps and rivers less so. So while efforts to preserve some last vestiges of New Zealand's Indigenous heritage had gained momentum in the first decades of the 20th century, the exploitation of rivers was only just beginning. New Zealand's rivers were generally too wild and unpredictable to be regarded as picturesque. The Avon River and the Whanganui River were exceptions that proved the rule. And as the slide indicates, the Whanganui River was sometimes actually referred to as the New Zealand Rhine, which is ironic in hindsight because even at this stage the Rhine was highly polluted. So it is kind of ironic when we look back at that today. And just to go down one of my promised diversions here, the Avon River was special not just because it aligned with the Victorian sense of the picturesque. It was also the first place to successfully introduce brown trout in New Zealand in 1867, an intriguing story that I cover in the book. The North Canterbury Acclimatisation Society, which introduced the trout, was one of the earliest and most successful societies in the country. And this society is noteworthy for another very important reason too, one which is very relevant to the discussion about freshwater today, but we'll come back to that later. And this sign, I don't know, has anyone found this in the gardens? It took me a wee while to find it, but it's well worth seeking out, complete with lichen decoration. For now, let's return to the main stem of the story. I was relating how New Zealand's rivers were generally too wild and too unpredictable to be seen as desirable, except that is by a handful of intrepid types, or lunatics, depending on one's point of view, who in handcrafted canoes pitted themselves against rivers for the sheer adventure of it. Except for these people, rivers continued to be perceived in a purely utilitarian way as a source of water for households, farming and industry, as power for generating electricity, and most unceremoniously, as drains. Their fast-flowing, turbulent nature, along with their relative shallowness compared to the majestic rivers of Europe and Britain, made New Zealand's rivers unsuitable for shipping. But these same characteristics made them excellent drains. Thus, when the population of the colony was still sparse, the sewage, sawmilling waste, gold mining waste, and other industrial waste spewed into rivers and streams was pushed out to the sea on the current, causing no apparent harm. The role of rivers as drains is not just a case of historic revisionism. This function was embedded in the legislation of the time. The Goldfields Act Amendment Act of 1875 allowed the government to proclaim any watercourse as a sludge channel, that's the actual term in the legislation, for the disposing of mining waste. And you have to admire the honesty, I think. This treatment of rivers as drains began to unravel in the first decade of the 20th century, when farmers began to complain that the dumping of gold mining waste was silting up rivers, elevating riverbeds, and making rivers more flood-prone, smothering the surrounding land with thick layers of silt. The worst affected river was Ohinemuri in the Thames Coromandel district. Eventually, the government caved into the mounting pressure and appointed a Rivers Commission to investigate damage to rivers in riparian land, its causes, how it should be addressed, and who should pay for the works required. More than a dozen rivers were investigated in this way during the 1910s and 1920s. Importantly, however, the Commission did not question the merits of human actions that had caused the damage in the first place. the one exception being tussock burning in the Clutha River catchment. Its identification of the causes was simply to enable it to determine how to distribute the burden of costs. Instead, the emphasis was on fixing or improving rivers through diversions, straightening, stop banks, and the judicious planting of trees. And I just note here too that river improvement was a phrase that often used in the literature at this time, and it really reveals a strong sense of trust in the human ability to fix nature. The perception of rivers as machines that could be harnessed and adjusted apparently without limit to optimise human benefits prevailed well into the post-war years. By this time, numerous rivers had hydroelectric dams built on them. In some cases, these hydro dams seriously affected the river, including diminishing its flows, severing migration routes of eels and other fish, and causing the build-up of siltation. Māori values and cultural heritage was ignored, or literally submerged in the case of hydro dams on the Waikato River, where burial caves were inundated by the reservoir for the Karapiro scheme, and the bones of tribal ancestors left to float away on the current. Initially, few voiced concerns about the exploitation of rivers. Anyone with misgivings knew that the need for electricity generation to power a growing economy and expanding cities would prevail over other considerations. And it's quite important, I think, to pause here and just note that until, I think, well into the 50s, blackouts due to lack of power supply were actually a fairly common occurrence. So it's quite important to understand the thinking within that context of the time, whereas today that, you know, we might get the occasional power cut, but that's about it. And this is where I would like to return to our friends, the North Canterbury Acclimatisation Society. Although the Otago Society was the first to be vocal about pollution, even before the first trout and salmon was introduced, in fact, it was the North Canterbury Society that made the most sustained effort at both a local and national level to have the pollution menace, as they called it, addressed. As early as 1893, the Society became concerned about cascades of effluent being discharged into the Waimakariri River from the wool scouring works at Belfast, and got samples of the water analysed, which revealed it to be, quote, highly putrescent and injurious to fish life. Sadly, its agitations were not rewarded by any action on the part of authorities. And 2 decades later, it was still reporting on discharges from the Belfast works, this time leading to the death of a large number of trout. It reported the matter to the Health Department, which I suspect did not much. In the 1920s, it commissioned a scientist at Canterbury College, this very institution, to analyse samples of water taken near the outfalls. His report, the scientist's report, concluded that the presence of considerable quantities of material capable of removing the dissolved oxygen from the water would detrimentally reduce the amount of that substance so necessary to fish life. That was a quote from his report. His analysis demonstrates that there was already a considerable understanding of water quality, particularly in respect to dissolved oxygen, which later became central to water quality testing and standards. And this is way back in the 1920s, almost 100 years ago. Through its efforts at a local level, though its efforts at a local level met with inertia, the Society was instrumental in raising the profile of the pollution epidemic at the national level. On the prompting of the Society, the 1924 National Conference of Acclimatisation Societies agreed that the government be urged to take steps to prevent the pollution of rivers and pressed for stricter controls on pollution. And by 1929, thanks largely to the instigation of the Society, the National Conference of Acclimatisation Societies had declared itself, and I quote, gravely concerned about the menace of pollution in our rivers. So this was nearly 90 years ago, and so I guess we can say that the society was ahead of its time. But I think the other thing it kind of demonstrates to me is that there was already a bit of feistiness from Canterbury, emanating from Canterbury when it came to rivers, and that kind of legacy has continued there's many advocates, and I think even Mike Joy, I'm pretty sure, came from Canterbury, and we also have the artist Sam Mann, who has novel ways of protesting around the... I could have included a photograph to demonstrate what I meant, but possibly not the best idea. So going back to the discussion of this evolution and the prevailing attitude towards our rivers, the efforts of the North Canterbury Acclimatisation Society aside, the turning point came for rivers in the 1970s with the emergence of an organised fraternity of rafters and canoeists. Initially small in number, over time, canoeing groups mushroomed throughout the country under the loose aegis of the National Canoeing Association. It was these groups that first expressed alarm at the progressive loss of New Zealand's scenically outstanding and wild rivers, and argued for the need to preserve rivers for their recreational value. Inspired by the American system for protecting wild and scenic rivers, canoe clubs advocated that outstanding wild and scenic rivers such as the Motu, the Whanganui and the Buller should be designated in a way similar to a national park. Canoe clubs around the country also made their opposition to local hydroelectricity generation projects clear. For example, in 1975, Ross Douglas of the Wellington Canoe Club wrote to the Commission for the Environment, which had only just been established, expressing the club's view on the proposed Ōtaki scheme. And I quote from his submission, "We are concerned that power schemes have already destroyed many of our canoeable rivers, and we refer to such rivers as the Clutha, the Waikato and the Waitaki. It follows, therefore, that we are concerned about our national waterways. We would seriously suggest the government give some thought to the preservation of our national waterways, which we consider are our natural heritage." This view was shared by the newly established Commission for the Environment, which in 1977 released a discussion paper proposing legislation to protect wild and scenic rivers. In 1981, the Wild Rivers Amendment to the Water and Soil Conservation Act 1967 was enacted. Within a year, the Kiwitu Trust had applied for the first water conservation order over the Motu River, considered by some as New Zealand's best whitewater river and North Island's last real wilderness. But it was not always canoeing that was the central driving force for the protection of rivers. In the case of the Manganui Aotearoa River in the North Island Central Plateau, the river's importance as habitat for trout and blue duck, or whio, was also dominant arguments. By this time, human pressures had forced the whio to retreat into the upper catchments of remote rivers. So when a hydro scheme was proposed on the river, there was an eruption of grassroots opposition. The opposition was unusual in its breadth. Not only were locals, recreational and conservation groups opposed, but also 4 government departments. This would be unheard of today. These were the Wildlife Division of Internal Affairs, Lands and Survey Department, the Department of Agriculture and Fisheries, and the Commission for the Environment. Eventually, in 1982, a minimum flow was set for the river, affording it some protection. Later, in 1989, a water conservation order was also gazetted over the river. In the early 1980s, the river became the site of the first in-depth study of the whio in its natural habitat. The 4-year study became the foundation for work on whio all over the country. This study is unlikely to have been possible had the river been significantly modified by a hydroelectricity dam, proving the river's worth as a wild river. I should note here too that some maintain that it was Whitewater New Zealand's application for a water conservation order on the Hurunui River in 2007, which initially met with success, that triggered the government to suspend elections for ECAN and put in commissioners. So water conservation orders have played a really important role both in the way stewardship of our rivers, but also in the broader political scene as well. The Wild Rivers legislation was a major step forward in terms of the protection of our rivers, but by definition, it was only the ones deemed special, mainly from an aesthetic or experiential perspective, that were given any protection. As we know today, an unseen but no less pernicious threat was gaining momentum: agricultural runoff, also known as diffuse discharges. Unlike dams and hydro stations or pipes carrying discharges from factories or sewage treatment plants, the pressure on rivers did not reveal itself clearly until the early 1990s. Combined with the mounting pressure from agricultural runoff was the increased use of river water and aquifers for irrigation to support pastoral farming in drier regions, Canterbury being one of those regions, of course. Much like climate change, more than a decade was lost over whether or not agricultural discharges were a threat to our freshwater bodies and over the relative magnitude of the problem and therefore responsibility to address it. Thankfully, today we seem to have moved beyond the endless arguments about whether intensive agriculture has been responsible for the degradation of our rivers and lakes. This seems beyond doubt. But there is still a strong reluctance on the part of successive governments to do anything that will encumber or constrain agriculture, the backbone of our economy. This stance is uncannily reminiscent of the government's reluctance to interfere with the gold mining industry in the early 20th century, which was responsible for choking numerous rivers with its waste. And remember, back then, the main complainants were actually farmers, but they were the underdog at that point. Farming wasn't as important as gold mining. This problem was not addressed by government intervening. Instead, it was resolved by the decline of the industry itself. The resource became depleted, and alluvial mining became economically unsustainable. Few of us would like to see a repeat of this for agriculture. It would be so much better, surely, if we could simply find a way to farm and carry out other economic endeavours too, in a way that does not deplete or degrade our natural resources and precious heritage. This would, in my view, be progress in the true sense of the word. By the way, I'm sure I have been talking in front of audiences where they actually thought Fonterra put this sign in the river. Now, I'd like to assure you they weren't responsible for this sign. But admittly, that was a talk for Probus, and the audience, the average age was a bit older, but they were a little bit confused that Fonterra would put a sign in. But and now I'd like to end with an epilogue of sorts. When I was finishing the manuscript for New Zealand Rivers in early 2016, I was somewhat mystified about why swimmability had not become a big issue for New Zealanders, despite it touching on so many ordinary New Zealanders' lives and indeed our identity as New Zealanders. In the book, I described how the issue of swimmable rivers was being raised by the Green Party, by a newly fledged campaign called Choose Clean Water, led by some young New Zealanders, and iwi leaders too, who have maintained their refusal to accept wadeability as the minimum standard for our rivers and lakes. Ngāi Tahu leader Mark Solomon had recently described the standard as ridiculous, explaining, when a child goes down to the river, they don't stop and say, is the river wadeable or swimmable? They jump. But despite this noise from the edges, the issue had not broken through into the realm of widespread public discourse. Well, a year later, all of this had changed. The government released its proposal to make 90% of New Zealand's rivers and lakes swimmable by 2040 in February this year. I can only imagine anticipating that it would be broadly welcomed as the Pest-Free New Zealand 2050 strategy was a few months before. But instead, the announcement triggered huge controversy. Opposition parties and NGOs and some scientists argued that the swimmability standard had simply been lowered, and others, such as the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment, were merely confused. And it takes quite a lot to confuse the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment. She's a bright lady. Many expressed dismay at the announcement, but I didn't. Finally, the issue was getting the attention it deserved. I was pleased too that we were getting some intelligent discussion that upends some long-held assumptions, something else I cover in the book. Economist Shamamil Yaqub had recently questioned whether the benefits we get from farming are worth the environmental price we pay and the other economic opportunities lost, and also argued that New Zealand's economy would not collapse even if all dairy ceased tomorrow. I don't profess to know the answer to these questions, but I'm glad that these debates were finally happening. I have to admit, more recently, as we approach the election, the debates have become a little bit less intelligent, but I guess that's an outcome of politics and the urgency some people feel to protect their interests. But even so, the upcoming election aside, I think we are witnessing, if you will pardon another pun, a watershed, not necessarily in seeing imminent change in our environment or how we treat it, but in terms of New Zealanders' awareness of our legacy, of the historic abuse of our rivers and the implications that has for us today. And as an environmental historian, I can't help wonder how these developments will be recorded in our history, whether they will be held up as a model to follow or a mistake for future generations to avoid. But aside from being an environmental historian who prides herself in being unrelentingly analytical and objective, I'm also a parent. As a parent, and as I find myself firmly ensconced in middle age, I'm experiencing an increasing sense of urgency in terms of our rivers and our environment more generally, the legacy I'm going to leave my children and their children, and a deeply held concern that because of the value we place on short-term profits and political expediency, we are allowing our children's future and their future choices to slip away. So I guess the question remaining for all of us is whether we would like to see this in the future, or this. Thank you. So I'll introduce questions myself. If anyone's got any questions or any reflections or anything, I often find it's the discussion afterwards that is the best part when I do a talk, far better than my talk, in fact. So if anyone's got any questions, I think we may even have a mic that we can hand round.
No, that's okay. How long was that picture, by the way?
Where?
No, how long was it? When was it taken?
Oh, I think not too long ago. This is not, I should add, this is the Waikato River. It's not near Hamilton. It's up, I think, more the upper end near Lake Taupo. So it's not, it's not, what do you call it? false facts. No, fake news. It's real. Yeah.
But it's relatively recent.
Yes, I believe so. Yes, I do believe so. Yeah. But not near Hamilton.
Catherine,
Yes.
you touched on the history of the New Zealand legislative development to protect waterways. And from what I can gather, it seemed to sort of stop in about 1980. Do you think we need to have another look at that, and also draw examples from international perspective of how we recognise and protect outstanding waterways legislatively?
Yeah, it's a really good question.
Catherine, can you just repeat your question?
Oh, sorry. Yes.
I know
The question.
those that are going to be asking questions
Yes.
up front,
Yes.
it's easy for you to communicate with Catherine, but all the folks back.
The question was about, the legislation to protect, so water conservation orders, basically, which was brought in the original Water and Soil Conservation Act, and then it actually was then transferred over to the RMA, and it's still live, and you'll know this because of the Huranui situation, and whether it sort of needs to be further progressed. One thing I know that has been highlighted as a fault of that particular mechanism is that it's very ad hoc and it's very reactive. So often what happens is that there's a specific threat to a particular waterway, and then a advocate, and it has ended up mainly being Fish and Game, simply because they are one of the few NGOs that have the considerable funds required to go through these processes, to then use a water conservation, an application for a water conservation to protect that river in the face of specific threats or sets of threats. And I know right from the beginning, when it was first introduced, even when it was the Commission for the Environment, there was a need recognised for having a less ad hoc reactive approach to this, and actually having a strategic, identifying what waterways should be protected, and a government body doing that, and then actually going out and protecting those for the various values they needed to be protected for. And this was attempted numerous times in my research. I think it was attempted at least once by the Commission for the Environment, and I know it's been talked about since the days of that the Ministry for the Environment has been in place. And I think the reason why it has fallen over, well, you can kind of guess, can't you? The level of opposition that would then, from various parties, that would create, and central government has been somewhat unwilling to bring that upon themselves, and I think it's fair to say that I think where central government has been lacking in leadership, not just in this space but in a lot of spaces in the environmental sphere, is providing that strategic national level leadership and saying that's out of bounds, that's off limits, or here are the limits. There's been very, very little of that, and instead they've left that mainly to regional councils. And of course, when regional councils don't get it right, you know what happens because you live in Canterbury. So, and I think, as it happens, I'm actually just finishing writing another book, and this looks at this in much greater depth, actually, this very, very question. I think it is a lot broader than water conservation orders, but it's a very good question. I don't know whether I may have only partially responded to your question, but that is something that came up a lot. Yeah. Oh, so we've got Laddie, could you? Because I don't want to be playing favourites. I don't want people to dislike me. So
It's just
could you do it on my behalf? So there were at least 3 hands here, and there was one hand here.
Has there been any environmental history just tracing the engineering industry works approach to rivers, communicate onto natural assessment of ecological environments?
Okay.
We can't hear
We can't hear anything.
everything that was in there, you just sweep away. You don't get any ripples.
Yes.
Right. So can we look at that?
Yeah, so for those who kind of missed the first part of that question, the question was the originally perhaps the engineering focused approach to rivers and kind of engineering them in a way that better meets human needs and where they're more controllable versus the more holistic integrated approach where you also consider ecological and recreational needs and so on. I think you're right. It has been worse in other countries, and I think thankfully in New Zealand, I mean, I spent a lot of time in Japan. Japan's a perfect example, actually, of pretty much, I was watching a documentary the other day, and I was astounded, actually, even I didn't know this, but pretty much every river, at least the lower course of every river in Japan, and there are an awful lot of them, has been channelized. And I think to a great extent that's happened in America too. And I know in America, this is, I think, really fascinating, and someone must be making a lot of money. A lot of the dams they put in the big dam era, they are now taking them out again. Yeah. So, which, gosh, they must have a big dump somewhere. But, so, look, I do think even, and it's not just the Ministry of Works, I think when you look at the catchment boards, they were very engineering focused, very hard engineering focused. And I don't think there's been sort of a bright line where everything changed. I think it has been progressive for sure. Probably right up to the sort of demise of catchment boards though, I think it was still quite engineering centric, and now more and more Yes.
We've got big flashing rivers, they just go.
Yes.
And a flood, and nothing happens, and nothing happens, and nothing happens. And then the car just moves.
Yes. Yeah, a lot more volatile our rivers compared to other countries, I think. Yes, definitely. So yes, I think there's definitely been a transition, that's for sure. Yeah. Yes.
Currently the media, and quite rightly so, focusing on intensive farming as the source of concern for our rivers, but of course having grown up in Manly too, I know the impact of urbanisation on the river, which works in dairy factories and also sewage systems. Do you have a feel for whether that urbanisation and industry are still at fault with discharge into rivers?
Oh, yes. Everyone heard that question. Didn't you all heard that? I don't know. Look, I actually, and that's what's been quite unhelpful about the sort of discourse we've had. It's really intensified leading up to the election, and it's so unhelpful. I guess it's inevitable, but it's all about laying blame again. And the fact is, and I tried very clumsily to explain this to a reporter yesterday actually, that we're all to blame. You know, this is, as I hope this talk has demonstrated, it's just a legacy, a layer upon layer of pollutants and abuse. The reason the poor old farmers are getting a bit of flack, in fairness, is because of the acceleration. So whereas, yes, some of our cities are growing, and you've got lots of pressures from cities, you do have point source discharges, but over time these have been better and better controlled and managed, and a lot more pollutants are being filtered out. Same with wastewater treatment plants. Having said that, some are still a real problem, like the one in Palmerston North that goes into the Manawatu River. But we haven't seen the New Zealand population expand in some regions, well, maybe, except for maybe Auckland, I'm not really sure, by, doubling or tripling, and we haven't seen water use due to irrigation expand at that same accelerated rate. So the problem has been with farming, how the curve of change, and the fact that, as I also tried to clumsily explain to the reporter yesterday, the fact that the very regions where this intensification is happening are the very regions that can least absorb it. And of course, as we know, Canterbury is one of those places because it has what scientists call leaky soils, and the nutrients, the contaminants just go straight through into the beautiful pure aquifers you have here in the groundwater and out to rivers, etc. And of course, because of the climate, you have to have irrigation to support the all year round pasture growth. So it's not like the intensification is spread evenly throughout New Zealand. If it was, potentially it would be less of a problem. It's because it's sort of happening where it should, the places that can least support it. So you're absolutely spot on. There are a huge number of pressures, and urban pressures are really important. I think the reason why poor old farmers are getting a lot of flack is just that growth, that acceleration that has really been over from around the mid-70s, and it's just taken off. And in fairness to farmers, anyone sort of entering or intensifying in the dairy sector, I don't think people didn't know in the beginning that this was going to be an issue. Although, having said that, can I just say one more thing? In my most recent research, in 1981, the OECD did its very first environmental report evaluating new, environmental policy and administration in New Zealand. And guess what? It said, and this is in 1981, and it did its research in 1980, we see that agriculture is intensifying in New Zealand. You need to watch out because high stocking rates will mean more nitrates. It will mean contamination of your waterways. It could have public health impacts. Why did they know that? Because it had happened in other countries, particularly in Europe. And so we were warned in 1981 by a highly respected international agency. From my research, I cannot see anything was done at that point to respond to that. Largely, that report was ignored. But interesting to know, isn't it? Yeah. There was one more question down here, laddie, wasn't there? Yes.
Sure.
There's been a lot of changes that some of us are older, very familiar with, and you mentioned the capital a moment ago. For a long period in time, anything that was called a swamp was thought was an abomination that had to be modified and grown.
Yes.
And Canterbury is a classic example of all of the areas around Christchurch City. The swamp is an important integrator between the wider landscape and the river system. And we really need to be reinstituting them and the ecology of those same areas. I mean, in the Manawatu, where you come from, that swamps were once a major industry.
Absolutely.
As they were around Christchurch. We had 16 facts members around Christchurch.
Oh, I didn't know that.
They weren't big, but they were there. And all of that went from the 1920s through to the 1960s. And we need to be cognizant of that fact that the swamp component is a very important ecological filter. And you can't just separate rivers from the wider landscape of which it's part.
Absolutely spot on, and I couldn't agree more. And I understand actually Laddie was telling me about some really interesting projects around the city where basically wetlands are being restored for those very reasons, and I think that's absolutely marvellous. And isn't the red zone, I mean, I don't know quite what's going to happen there, but wouldn't that be an amazing opportunity seen nowhere else in the world? And we could be, you know, Christchurch could be the showcase of.
What's happening actually on the bottom end of the Avon right now?
Well, there you go. So I couldn't agree more. And I also, one thing I have to say, you're quite right. And I felt actually, it's good that you highlight that, because I felt quite uncomfortable and kind of mechanical and about saying I'm only going to write a book about rivers, because they are so integrated. And from the Māori perspective, if anything, it was the wetlands that were even more important as a source of food and other resources than the rivers, and they saw them as an integrated whole too. So you're absolutely right. Unfortunately, for the purposes of writing a book, I kind of had to focus on rivers, but it is so true. And I think if we had retained at least even a few more wetlands, we would have far fewer problems with floods and so on, because not only are they ecological regulators, but they're floodwater. That's what they do. They absorb excess water from floodwaters and so on. So, yes, wouldn't that be great? Bring back the flax milling industry.
That's a great talk. Thank you very much.
Oh, thank you.
I'm just wondering, do you see great hope in future for legislation such as to giving very decimal status in the river?
Oh, yes, I've been asked this before, and my answer then wasn't great, and I fear that my answer this time is not going to be much better. I should have studied up. But I do think it's great. You know, and we had the funny conversation actually about, you know, the fact that a river being given the status of a person, they can actually take people to court. And we were musing about how that would be a river going to court, you know, could be quite wet. But look, I think anything where we haven't been great at thinking about the value of natural resources, and even that word, the term natural resource, implies that it is useful because it's a resource to us as people. And even the, you know, for example, water conservation orders, what was behind them was really, even though it was much broader than the values placed on rivers before, it was still about the values we as humans could extract from rivers. So I think what that does, conferring the status of a person to a river does, is it makes us think about that entity as something that has worth in and of itself and needs to be valued for no other reason than it exists and should continue to exist. So I think in that way that's really great, and I think it kind of philosophically stretches us, and I think that's always a really good thing. Because we haven't been too great. There is this idea of intrinsic value, and we haven't been too great at valuing that just on its own. It's very rare that something is preserved only because of its intrinsic value. There's usually something else. So yeah, no, I think it's a great thing. Not being a lawyer, I don't quite know how it's going to play out. I would love to see a river go to court though. I think that would be fun to watch. But yeah, thank you.
Thanks very much, Catherine. That was wonderful.
Oh, thank you.
Wonderful. Can I just ask whether or not you picked up through your research any sense that standards and requirements around water quality have actually alienated people from the rivers?
Can you expand on that a bit more?
I'm just wondering, standards came in force, I'm not quite sure when, but we're often told that rivers don't meet certain quality standards,
yes.
chloride or
yes.
nitrates, and we often refer to the past where we used to be able to jump in the rivers without worrying about it. But of course, we're all very conscious of water quality not meeting standards, and we see signs, and I just wonder whether you picked up through that history whether there was some moment at which we started putting up signs and then where we did with that kind of allegation.
That's a very, very, very good point, and I think you are right. In fact, was it you, Peter, that told me the story about drinking from the Manawatu? back in, what decade was that?
It's only probably about 30 odd years ago.
Yes, and it's, you know, and I don't think, I possibly should have embarrassed you, I'm sorry, but that really highlights the fact that there was a lack of awareness, you know, only a few decades ago, and yet, in some cases, those waterways may have actually improved because what we've done with points with Christchurch is we are actually controlling and regulating them a lot better, and there's better technical, our ability to actually get the contaminants out is vastly improved. And I think you're quite, what you're suggesting, there was an age of innocence, and I think I grew up in that age too. I grew up right next to the Manawatu River, and we jumped in at the drop of a hat, and the only thing we were worried about was being knocked unconscious by a large log or something. It was not, pollution did not even enter into our minds, and yet it was probably pretty polluted then too. I think yes, I think that is right, that it probably has made people a lot more wary, but I also think probably on the part of especially regional councils, there's this sense of wanting to cover themselves now a lot more too. I know, you know, in the region where I live in now, there's signs up now basically saying you need to judge whether you think this is clean enough to swim in. In other words, subtext, don't blame us if you go, you know, you swim and get sick. So I think it probably is a reflection of that, the risk, perceived risk, not just to people but to institutions, of being blamed for someone getting sick, whereas in the good old days you didn't really blame anyone. You did get sick, but you didn't sue the council or whatever. But yeah, I think you are right, and I think we do need to acknowledge that there will be rivers that were much more polluted, say 50, 60, 70 years ago than they are today. There'll be plenty that are not, though, as well.
Thank you, Catherine.
Thank you.
My question's about the national policy statement and the limit setting process that they're trying to put in place, and how that is basically going to confer the power and responsibility for making decisions about acceptable pollution or quality of rivers onto local government and local communities. And if you've looked at or know of research internationally about if that's been successful in terms of moving that decision making from central government and standards based to a more regional, local government community decision making process.
I haven't specifically looked at that, and I have to say that's not a new thing. You know, ever since the RMA was enacted, we have one of the most delegated, setups for environmental administration, where a lot of these decisions are being delegated down, and central government only really provides the high level policy. So none of that's not new. No, I haven't looked into comparable, ways other countries do it, but I do suspect that in many of them it would at least be state level, and maybe the day-to-day operation will be delegated down, but not necessarily the interpretation, or if you see what I mean. So I do think we are a lot more delegated down to, that subsidiarity or whatever policy wonks call it.
If national stay in for a bit longer, maybe we'll see the success or failure of that approach. And it'll be interesting to see those conflicts that will arise, I think, in those local settings.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And I think we've seen instances of that in other areas too, of environmental policy to date, in fact. Yes. I wonder whether we need to wrap up. Oh, one more?
Okay. How do you feel about the current efforts of like water conservation, and what can you do as the general public to help support?
What was the very beginning of that, sorry?
Yeah, how do you feel about the current efforts of water conservation, and what can we as the general public do to like accelerate, I guess, or help guide betterment of our rivers, I guess?
Yeah. So you mean in terms of water quality, general quality of our
I
waterways?
guess just like how we're at.
Well, yes.
Yeah.
I have to say, and I've definitely written about this. I don't think that what happened with the announcement earlier this year, the government brought out its proposal for cleaner rivers, and that was when it had 90% cleaner rivers by 2040. It all got a bit unstuck when people realised that fiddled with the standard. But even the fact that the government brought out a proposal saying that it would make the new goal swimmable rivers was entirely the result of public pressure. Because repeatedly the Minister for the Environment over the previous several months had said that we are not going to shift to that goal. Wadeable is enough. It's going to be too costly. Wadeable is enough. Repeatedly. In fact, the statement generally used was, it's just not practical. And nothing's changed. The money hasn't changed, the cost hasn't changed, the way to restore rivers hasn't changed. What changed was the pressure from the public and a number of NGOs very, very active in the Clean Water campaign, etc., raising awareness, and this the pressure just kept on. It was relentless, and the government had to basically bring something out. As it turned out, it was less than ideal because people were a bit suspicious about what they'd actually done. But that, I believe, is one of the best things we can do, is make ourselves aware and know when the wool is being pulled over our eyes. Awareness is so, so important. Particularly when actually it comes to things like water quality, because it's very easy to be blinded by the jargon and the technical stuff. And I hope, for example, one of the things that I really, this is terrible self-promotion here, but one of the things I really aimed to do through writing this book was really explain, because I'm not actually very smart at all, so I wanted to be able to explain water quality and its degradation to myself in simple terms, so that everyone else could get it too, so that everyone knows when they're being told a pack of, that they know better. And I think knowledge is so powerful, really powerful, so important, especially coming up to an election. Get out and vote.
So, thank you everybody for coming out tonight, and thank you to UC Connect for hosting us here. And Catherine Montgomery and I were just talking before the talk, and we have a moral responsibility to be optimistic and to not be fatalist. So, in whatever way you think it is Saturday, get out there and make Saturday count. And with that, I'd like everybody to join me.